Do you ever hear people refer to something as classical art or classicism, and you're wondering, what exactly are you talking about? In the last episode, we talked about what art historians and academics generally refer to as classical antiquity. If you haven't seen it, please click here to watch, and there will also be a link in the description. Have you seen it? Okay, I'm going to assume you've watched it and now you're back. So now let's talk about classicism, or a revival of classical traditions. So the confusing thing is sometimes when people use the term classicism, they're not talking about the original Greco-Roman period from the ancient times. They're in fact talking about a revival of that, which occurred roughly around the 15th and 16th century CE in Europe, specifically Italy. Some of you may have heard this term called the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth. A rebirth of what? A rebirth of the classical Greco-Roman academic traditions, of course. So if you watched the last episode, you'll remember we mentioned a guy named Vitruvius, who wrote this famous book called The 10 Books on Architecture, published in about the 1st century BCE. Various copies of this book did survive throughout the ages, but it didn't become widely circulated in Europe until around the 15th century, and that's because the printing press wasn't invented until the 15th century. So it was first translated into Italian in around the early 1400s and came into the hands of various people such as Brunelleschi, Alberti, and Leonardo da Vinci. You may have heard of some of these people. In fact, arguably, Leonardo's most famous drawing, the Vitruvian Man, is in fact based on Vitruvius's ideal proportions of a human body. While people like Leonardo and Brunelleschi are probably the most famous and most well-known, the most significant adopter of Vitruvian principles during the Renaissance was probably architect Andrea Palladio. While his architectural legacy is mostly composed of lesser-known residential projects such as the Villa Rotunda, it was once again his writings that made him one of the most influential architectural thinkers in history. He famously authored the 4 books on architecture. Yeah, I know, architects are not the most creative when it comes to book titles. These books, much of it inspired by Vitruvius, outline things like architectural orders, decorative styles, housing design, city planning, and urban design. Long story short, these books basically became a Bible for architects across the Western world for generations. Classical revival and the Renaissance are also often associated with the movement humanism, which in a nutshell was a movement based on human idealism, virtue, and individualism separate from Christian religious doctrine. And these values of humanism were consistent with ancient Greco-Roman thinking. Which is why in Renaissance painting and sculpture, we also see this emphasis on human anatomy, ideal proportions, ideal human figures, as well as references to ancient Roman stories, gods, and philosophers. Now, I know sometimes it seems like the Renaissance has just been one of these topics that feels like it's just been talked about and studied to death. Yet it's still a very complex topic to fully grasp, and there are many differences depending on the time period specifically and depending on the place. But it's important to understand that the Renaissance isn't just something that happened instantaneously. If you're interested, I have an older video on Gothic art, and I talk about how those styles in that period eventually very, very gradually morphed into the Renaissance movement. Anyway, classicism definitely doesn't stop there. So let's revisit this topic next week when we talk about neoclassicism in the 18th and 19th centuries. And to keep up to date on future episodes, I would click the big button right here so that you don't miss anything.